Historian, author, and journalist Jeff Pearce has once again come to Ethiopia to personally witness what is going on the ground and to convey this message to the whole world. He has traveled to different parts of the country and personally seen some of the destruction trails left by the TPLF. And I'm going to spend some time with him in this edition of Addis Dialogue. With it, I'm Shifaralako. Do stay with us. Jeff, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
One of the areas that you paid a visit to was the Lalibela rock-hewn churches, which escaped the destructive touch, if you will, of the TPLF. Have you approached some of the locals there? And if so, what have you found out?
I went there with photojournalist Jamal Countess, and we traveled with several IDPs. So in terms of locals, I can say that it was kind of a sort of different kind of homecoming than, say, what the Ethiopian government has in mind for, say, the diaspora. These people had been away from their homes for months. So yes, I suppose you could say I was talking to locals there. These people have been through tremendous trauma. They didn't get to speak to their family members. In some cases, they lost their family members. There was a horrible, tragic story of at least one woman who was a friend of Jamal Countess's, who I believe a cousin was raped, another cousin was killed, and she doesn't know what she's coming home to, whether their house is going to still be there, because it was located near one of the major hotels in Lalibela. Fortunately, the house is okay, but of course, it's a bittersweet homecoming, because there's your family members, and you go, okay, you get to go home, but also to what? Because when we left, there was no running water, there's no power, there's no light, there's no Wi-Fi. Food options were limited for us. God knows how the locals are getting on. I saw like bajajas, if I'm pronouncing it right, puttering away in the town. I don't know where they got their gasoline. So if I can insert a little message here for the diaspora community, when you come home, and if you want to visit some of these places, be prepared to pitch in and help to rebuild, because they need it. You would not believe the devastation that is there. So that's as far as the locals are concerned.
As some of the witnesses who spoke to us say, Jeff, this global heritage could still be in danger following the heavy explosions and the vibrations around it. What are some of your observations in this regard? We
went to the churches. I was very highly motivated to get there. I had been there, I'd visited Lalibela in 2013, blew my mind. I mean, it is without question one of the great cultural sites of the world. And so I wanted to urgently get there and go, okay, what state are these things in? So Jamal and I were the first Westerners who actually got in to inspect, to talk to the priests and see the churches among the media after the Second Liberation. And the priest said, not to worry, all the relics are safe, all the manuscripts are safe. They put them away in, say, the museum. They took them out again. But they were concerned because the TPLF thought nothing in terms of saying, well, we're going to put our artillery on here. And this is a hill. I can't remember the distance, Jamal would, but it's within my vision, and I've got pretty bad vision, and you cannot put a piece of artillery directly above a site like that without the sound barrage hurting the actual structural integrity of these complexes. They're volcanic rock. They were sculpted centuries ago for the very reason that they're soft volcanic rock. So imagine what that boom, boom, boom is doing. So the priests and church officials quite rightly want UNESCO and scientists get over there and check to see, are they okay? And hopefully this never happens again where something like that is put in jeopardy.
This being as it is, Jeff, also as you said, the UNESCO has deliberately ignored this and conspicuously failed to denounce the attempts of destruction by the TPLF. So should this have happened in the first place, and what is going on?
No, and on a personal note, I'm disgusted. There was an association, I have it upstairs in my notes, but the thing is, I believe it's called the Amhara Professionals Association. They actually wrote to UNESCO months ago and said, look, what are you doing? This is your World Heritage Site. Why are you not monitoring this? Why are you not reaching out, at least to the TPLF, to get assurance from them that it is safe? Where was UNESCO during this time? And for that matter, if I can add, I just saw an item today in terms of how various mosques in the Afar region and the Amhara region are being desecrated and destroyed and damaged. And where is UNESCO for that? Where is the world outrage for that? This comes at a time when the TPLF are blatantly trying to manipulate the Muslim community and try to get it on its side in a shameless effort to create some last-minute support. And yet they do this. You know, it's like saying, we want Christian help after you destroy churches. The focus is on Lalibela, but keep in mind, as we came there, we passed a monastery where you could see that it had been hit by artillery several times. So when we're calling out UNESCO, what we are talking about is the TPLF committing a war on Ethiopian culture. You know, it's not just the people, it's not just the infrastructure, it's not even just the values, it's everything, the whole ball of wax, all of Ethiopian civilization, centuries old. And why? Because you're dealing with a fascist organization that can't tolerate something that rivals it culturally on its own. Yeah. You see this, and by the way, if I can just add a note here, you see this in terms of their laughable attempts to rewrite history, in terms of parking everything that is good about Ethiopian history and suddenly making it just Tigrayan. Nobody denies the contributions of Tigrayans to history, or Tigray to history. But I'm sorry, Tigray was not responsible for the cultures of Egypt, Nubia, Mesopotamia. It's laughable. No, Adwa was not just a Tigrayan victory. So when they come up with this alternative farcical history, at the same time they have to attack the institutions like Lalibela, like the other monasteries, like the mosques, to destroy them down. And that way they can prop up this phony narrative of history. So this is quite deliberate. It's all part of a whole.
Also, the atrocities committed by the TPLF, as it is observed, Jeff, include damaging of schools and health institutions. The same way as the UNESCO, we didn't notice condemnation of the atrocities from the WHO, not to mention its Director General's personal bias.
Well, the fact of the matter is I still have sources who have given me documents, their own documents, including a UN security alert, which made it very clear that UN staff are looking the other way when the TPLF were doing forced recruitment. They were looking the other way and basically bargaining with the TPLF when the TPLF would snatch Ethiopian local staff and detain them. This is in their own, this is according to witnesses and people who work within the UN, my sources, who said the UN officials would go over to the TPLF and have to haggle to get their own staff back. And when they did, the TPLF said, okay, well, you're going to reassign this person, right? You're going to kick him out of the region, right? And the UN said yes. So where is that? I have documentation from them which says TPLF raided and vandalized our own warehouses and our vehicles. This was not made public. Why? Why did it not be made public? So when you look at, say, the hierarchy from Antonio Guterres down, of course this guy, you know, how do we look at this guy and say, you're accountable? Because all of this is going on his watch. This man tweeted and said, oh, conspiracy theories, blah, blah. No, I have your own pages written by your own staff tell me how that's a conspiracy when it's written by your own people. So I just, every time somebody brings up the UN, I have to burst into derisive and very bitter laughter, because this is supposed to be the highest expression of governance in the world, in terms of governments coming together and formulating answers for themselves and resolving their own differences. And instead, what we see is tolerance of a terrorist group working within its own auspices.
Also, there is a rumor that says some foreigners were, supporting the terrorist group in person. I know you've taken much time going around and talking to the local people there. So what have you found in this regard?
You have to remember that in past African conflicts, if we take, for instance, the Nigerian Civil War back in the 60s, there were always mercenaries, there were always foreigners mixing it up. So we shouldn't be surprised that they come out of the woodwork here. The question is, who are they working for and why? And you can see some of these shady characters, even in the major hotels in Addis. I mean, it doesn't take, I'm a bold white dude, but I'm over the hill. When you see another guy who's about, say, half my age, with a short-cropped, brush-cut hair and a certain build, and he's wearing khaki, you got to wonder, what's that guy doing here for? But let's give you a more concrete example. Jamal Countess and I visited the Cliff Edge Hotel. It was a known base for the TPLF. It was hit by either a drone strike or artillery. It's not quite clear which, but what is clear is the extent of the damage. There was a bus right out front of the hotel. It looked like a burned out Hulk, like something had hit it. And the glass was just blown out from the hotel windows behind. Damage, very specific, the type of damage that you would get with a strike of that kind. Now, we're busy looking around. There's one room, in fact, there was blood on the floor, just a mess, and other things. And a local is there, and he says, well, I'm a friend of the owner. And he says, we saw two Ferengi, one who was Asian and the other who was white. And these guys had been there for 4 months. And they were always fiddling around with these console-type equipment, which the implication was that was either military equipment consoles designed to run, say, drones or to run satellite image or something. This guy strikes me as credible. He's in my video report. Why? Because why would you make up an Asian guy? For those who wanted to plant the seeds of doubt, they would probably pick, say, an Arabic person, or they would pick two whites. But he specifically said an Asian person and a Ferengi, and he had trouble articulating what the equipment looked like. He clearly wasn't super familiar with it, but, you know, they're busy fooling around with that. And we're taking this in, we're going, okay, that changes the game. We can only draw limited conclusions from this, because we don't know whether these were mercenaries, we don't know whether these were working on behalf of a Western government in some kind of hidden capacity. I'm not going to be disingenuous and speculate, but I do find it damn odd. What the hell were they doing there? And as you know, there have been isolated reports of other Westerners suddenly mixing it up, and at least if I recall correctly, there was some witnesses who saw the TPLF leaving Lalibela in the company of some Ferengi. What were they doing? Going with them, retreating. Why? It would be very interesting to know. And it shouldn't surprise anyone, I should add, for anyone who says, ooh, conspiracy, who sees this clip. Well, we know for a fact that during the time that the TPLF were fighting the Derg and rising to power in the years that followed, of course, Western governments were befriending them and getting them on their side, and we're over here. So don't anybody try to tell me, ooh, it's a conspiracy. No, we have witnesses now.
Yeah. So, as rebels marched into Lalibela, they plundered houses and hotels, committed war crimes ranging from rapes to murder. In this regard, what did you see, Jeff?
You go into Lalibela, and we arrived, and our own hotel was actually one of the ones that got off lightly because they had drunken everything. They had wrecked the safe. For some reason, their thing is like a Viking horde to immediately go for either the booze or the money. There are other shots. Jamal Countess took photos of others where the safes are all smashed in. And they just went on wanton destruction. You go down to the police station and it's a wreck. You go to the administration offices and it's like a cyclone hit. I think in my own copy I referred to it as a cyclone frozen in a still image, because imagine this floor covered in papers and debris. There's no reason to do that. They carted away hard drives. They carted away anything that they could take back to Tigray. And there was one officer of the Amhara police who was so visibly angry, and he said to one of our team, "I blame America for this." And I wanted to get him on camera to interview him. He didn't know me, but there's no reason why he should, but he just communicated clearly through our translator and said, "I'm not doing this, I'm not talking to this guy." And who could blame him? You know, who could blame him? Because here I am, a white Ferengi who shows up, and I represent, you know, to his eyes, everything in terms of supporting these creeps who destroyed his city. So it was just awful. You walk out there and you're just furious. You know, there's a sign for the admin, and right behind it is just debris everywhere.
It also speaks volume, right?
Yeah, it does. It speaks volumes about the values of the enemy that you're dealing with.
Some journalists and analysts like Alex de Waal have repeatedly expressed their support for the TPLF and attachment to this group. So this can be reasonable enough to assume that they have a personal interest, if you will, in their reporting on Ethiopia, right? Yeah. So how can they expect Ethiopians to believe them?
They shouldn't, and I don't think they do, and I don't think they care. I think Tronville is, Kettle Tronville is getting increasingly nervous. A landmark paper, if I can call it that, was put out only a day or so ago by Anne Fitzgerald and Bronwyn Bruton in foreign policy, which just does a fantastic analysis. Then you have a Reuters report by a journalist and author I'm not terribly familiar with, but an accomplished gentleman called Stephen Gray, who, except for some minor quibbles, did a pretty good job. And Tronville now claims that Gray misquoted him. And you can almost hear the panic in Tronville's tweets because the truth is catching up with him. This is a guy who tried to play international observer for the election, if you recall, ages ago, and we know how well that went down. This is a guy who has invested his academic, professional career and his personal reputation in an alliance with a terrorist group. And the same with Alex de Waal, who in his book material writes in just nauseatingly romanticist terms about riding in the back of a truck, I believe, if I'm quoting it correctly, I hope I am, with TPLF soldiers. Also lies by omission in terms of his material. Writes about how the TPLF were just had the good of the people in mind. No reference to the fact that they were also stealing aid from their own people. Alex de Waal also goes about on a personal basis bragging about his intelligence connections. I know this for a fact. So he has a lot of explaining to do, and I can only hope that the truth catches up with these guys sooner rather than later. They'll be fine in the long run because they'll stay in the West and their reputations might get a hit, but unfortunately, that's the best we can hope for, that they should be held accountable, but they're not. A very good article, by the way, was done on how, and I didn't know this until it came out, on how Alex de Waal was doing this same kind of nonsense during the conflict in Rwanda. And it makes you wonder, what is it with this guy? He goes from crisis to crisis, inserting himself as an authority and leaves just a trail of tears behind him, a trail of devastation. This guy is the academic version of a war criminal.
Let's also talk about Africa and the United Nations Security Council. As you know, Africa doesn't have a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. But this council passes laws and decisions on the continent. So isn't this high time that Africa demanded a permanent seat there, in your view? What do you think?
The trouble is that we are looking for a large-scale overhaul in institutions far and wide. When you say Africa doesn't have a seat on the permanent UN Security Council, the thing is, which country? We've got 54 to choose from. And who should get it? And then of course, you can imagine, you can almost predict the discussion that will come out of it, that claims, well, Africa isn't stable. Africa isn't, like, what country in Africa is stable enough to be entitled to this seat? So just watch. If anybody ever suggests this, watch immediately what happens, because they'll come out with this, well, what about the stability of Africa? To which I just lose my temper, because I don't see much stability among the other members. Now, the more practical question is, which country are you going to choose? Are you going to choose Nigeria? Are you going to choose Ghana? Are you going to choose Botswana? Are you going to choose Ethiopia? I could make a very good case for Ethiopia having a permanent seat, because one could say, you just had one of the freest, fairest, most transparent elections in the history of the continent. That is an achievement. And I would say, give it to Ethiopia. Now, of course, they would not want this to happen immediately, especially during this conflict, but I would say that Ethiopia has kind of earned it with that. But again, to go back full circle to what I said at the top of my answer, you also need to overhaul all these other systems. You shouldn't have, until you fix it, a permanent member on the Security Council before you free Africa. And by that I mean that most of the citizens on this continent can't travel as freely as they like. They can't take even a holiday to Italy. They can't go to Germany for a conference. Why? Why is it that you have restrictive trade policies that block your commerce? Why is it that you have all these systems that treat the continent like a gulag, where you're growing crops for these in Europe and not feeding your own? So to me, yes, it would help, but then you got to look at all these other systemic issues and say, let's get that in order as well, because I don't see any momentum to help Africa that way from the other members of the Security Council, or from even the UN General Assembly in terms of these things. Let's put a historical spin on it. The very reason why, and we can talk all day, I don't have the time, and neither do you, to parse the benefits and the drawbacks of the African Union. But the whole point of why the African Union was created was Haile Selassie went to the League of Nations and said, why won't you help us? What answer shall I take back to my people, is the famous line. And of course, there was no answer. They just, abandoned Ethiopia. So after the liberation, after the Second World War, after the UN, he correctly and shrewdly recognized, oh, this is going to be the same business all over again, and starts to be one of the founders of the African Union. So you would have a show of your own. Now, has it lived up to its potential? That's a debate for another time. But what you need more than anything, more than a seat at the table, before you have that seat at the table, is you need African unity, again. Real African unity, not the unity of, say, Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta and the others. That was fine, but it was also parked and couched in Marxist ideology, like and like, thinking, well, if we go this model, we can completely overturn the neo-colonialists. Forget all that. Just go for the unity in terms of we got to act in our own collective interests as a continent. This is how we save ourselves, by saving ourselves together. That is also what the No More movement is trying to do. You know, I can't speak for them, but I know the organizers. I know that's one of the things they want to do. They want that Pan-African unity.
Recently, in one of your articles here, you argue that it's time for Ethiopia to put the US, the UN, and the TPLF on trial. Explain that to me.
Been disgusted all this time by the relentless effort of the TPLF, a terrorist group which has its own lobby organization in Washington, which shamelessly is trying to drag the Prime Minister of this country in front of the International Criminal Court. Von Battenberg Corporation, whatever it is, managed to get Ethiopia kicked out of AGOA. They are incredibly evil, and we can't let this momentum happen in terms of this nonsense about the ICC. And I thought about this for a long time, and I went, okay, you guys have never had original thought in your heads. Well, let's swipe from you for a change. And in 1967, the philosopher Bertrand Russell, a British soft-spoken Tweedy guy, brilliant philosopher, came up with the idea of a people's tribunal. It had no legislative authority. It had no government sanction. Nobody was ever going to go to prison or do anything. It was just a, well, it's kind of unfair to call it a public relations exercise, but it was. But it was 1967. The world, and America in particular, had not, it was starting to go the way of the anti-war movement, but not enough. And what the tribunal did was it laid out the case against the United States in terms of its war crimes in the Vietnam War. And for those who are younger, who don't know, the Americans used napalm, deforested good chunks of Vietnam and Cambodia, so places that are still trying to recover to this very day, slaughtered thousands of people through bombings, through attacking villages and other things. And the tribunals laid out that case. Now, did it make a difference? It did, to a certain extent. It had an influence because it had some very distinguished names like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, writers Alice Walker, James Baldwin, activist Stokely Carmichael. All of these distinguished people lent their names to this, and they sat as sort of a judgment panel as the case was laid out. But it was the laying out of the case itself that was the point. And so what we need now is the TPLF want to play these games of trying to politicize the ICC. Okay, well, let's have an African People's Tribunal. Let's lay out the case against you and your US supporters and the EU and the UN, because if you go onto a street on Washington, D.C., or if you go even in my hometown of Toronto, or Chicago, or Boston, or Paris, if you talk to the average person who looks like me, they can't explain to you the dynamics of this conflict. They don't know. And if they do know, all they've heard is a headline that says, oh, Tigray genocide. They need to know, no, you've been suckered. You've been suckered by a relentless propaganda campaign with the support of the US government backing a terrorist group. So we have to lay it out. We have to fight back, and we need that kind of spectacle. Now, part and parcel to that, the fact is that, as you know, we can't get Western media to pay proper attention because the doors are closed. There have been a few cracks in it, but by and large, no. So my plan, if this can come to being, is I would say, you don't get to come. I've worked for these operations. I know how they think. and they hate being left out of the party. If you hold a party, if you hold an event and you say, I'm sorry, CNN, you can't come. No, AFP, you don't get to come. They lose it. They just, we're entitled, we're the best media in the world, why can't you allow us in? No, this is how you lied about us. Come back in a while. They hate that. They believe that they are the moral arbiters of the world, that they decide what news is. And I am here to tell you, you don't. You don't. It's decided by the truth. It's not decided by your spin. So we have to organize the spectacle, and it would be a spectacle, but it would be a spectacle with truth as the goal. And it would be useful for historical research in the end. And then you make it clear, you don't get the monopoly on the truth anymore.
So how can the African People's Tribunal system by Africa potentially reduce dictatorial accusations, if you will, of some Western nations against African leaders that say no to their meddling endeavors, like the Ethiopian Prime Minister?
What has happened is that for people are throwing out the term neo-colonialist, and they're quite accurate. And then, of course, the opposition says, well, that's like rhetoric, that's old school, that's old-fashioned rhetoric. And what they don't realize is that it's absolutely an accurate term to use. If you are going to say, if you're going to lecture an entire continent and insist that your system of justice, your system of governance, the way you look over, the way that you examine and your analysis of another country is correct, there's no parity, there's no equality there. And so, of course, it's new colonialist, because you're saying, you Africans, if you don't behave, you know, and it's ridiculous because it's intolerable, because we're supposed to be living in the time of Black Lives Matter. But apparently African lives don't matter. And apparently, and they don't even hear themselves when they do it. They say, you know, Feltman's going over to Addis Ababa to like sternly talk to the Prime Minister. And of course, the Prime Minister is within his rights to say, no, I'm not going to meet with this guy. And if I remember correctly, he didn't. And why should, but the thing is, the guy got on a plane and thought that the doors should open thus for him. And the arrogance of this position. So tribunals like this, even if they have no actual legislative authority or power, have the potential to send a message back to the West to say, you don't get to tell us how to run our affairs anymore. Your form of justice, which is heavily just with acting on your own political interests, doesn't get to hold sway anymore. I mean, one of the most encouraging things of all was the US goes, we're counting down before we kick Ethiopia out of AGOA. Now, whether it hurts Ethiopia or not, obviously it will. But don't you feel a surge of pride over the fact that there's a good portion of Ethiopians who went there and said, okay, we'll just carry on and do it. We'll manage, we'll survive, we don't need your charity. The whole continent has to start talking like that, in my humble opinion. I hope it's up to them. I make these observations. I like to think that I'm a friend to Ethiopia, that I'm a friend to other African states. I was sent here with the privilege of looking into conditions and occasionally spreading the message as my sponsors see it. They give me a lot of leeway to speak my mind. And I hope that what I say helps. But what's atrocious is that I have to say it. Why is it they're not listening to someone like you, or him, or him? Why is it that they're not listening? Why is it that it takes the white Ferengi guy to say, hey, you don't get to dictate to 54 other countries how to do their business. So that's...
Yeah, they're also patronizing you in some way.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And a tribunal is spectacle. But the thing is, they've shut the doors on listening. So you got to create a noise to get their attention. Okay, here's an idea. And I hope others will actually take it up and use it. I hope. We'll see.
We'll see indeed. Jeff, thank you so much for your ideas.
Thank you.
Well, dear viewers, with that, we come to the end of today's program, and many thanks for your company so far. Until I see you next time with yet another program, it's goodbye from me, Shfarao Laiko. Bye-bye.